The number on the screen was $344. That's what was left in an account that was supposed to hold $68,000. I'd been sitting at my kitchen table at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, trying to find a medical reimbursement form, and I clicked the wrong tab, and there it was. $68,000 reduced to $312.44. And the transaction log showed 41 months of withdrawals, every single one of them authorized by my father, who was the account's co-trustee, and every single one of them categorized under the same description: family education expense. I wasn't in school. I hadn't been in school in 6 years. My name was on that account. My grandfather had opened it for me before I was old enough to know what compound interest meant. And the money was gone, spent. And I would spend the next 3 weeks learning exactly where it went and what it had bought and whose name was on everything it purchased. My name is Diane Calloway. I'm 33 years old. I'm a registered nurse working cardiac ICU in Portland, Oregon. I have a younger brother named Cole who is 29, and he is, by every metric my family has ever used to measure a person's worth, the one who mattered more. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded when I was 7 years old, and I know how it sounds now. It doesn't make it less true. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the end of it, the lawyers and the settlement and the account statements and the thing I said to my father in front of my aunt and uncle at a dinner table in November, none of it makes sense without knowing where it started. And where it started wasn't with the missing money. It started with a boy who came home from the hospital in the fall when I was 4 years old, and the way my mother looked at him, and the way something in the architecture of our family rearranged itself around that look, and never rearranged back. Cole was an easy baby. I remember that because people said it constantly, in that specific way adults use to communicate something that isn't about the baby at all. He was easy, and I had been, apparently, not easy. Colicky, they said, which I only learned later because no one talked about my infancy the way they talked about Cole's. Cole slept through the night at 6 weeks. Cole smiled early. Cole had my father's eyes and my mother's chin, and some perfect combination of both of them that made strangers stop in grocery stores and say things. I was a quiet child with glasses and a habit of reading during family events, which my mother described as being in her own world, with a tone that made it sound like a mild deficiency. I wasn't in my own world. I was reading. I was paying attention to everything around me, including the attention that wasn't directed at me. The first time I remember understanding what was happening, I was 9. Cole was 5, and he'd started t-ball, and my parents attended every single game, both of them, together on Saturday mornings, which was remarkable because my parents didn't do things together on Saturday mornings as a general rule. My gymnastics meets were on Saturdays too, that same season. My mother came to 2 of them, my father came to none. I asked him once, directly, I was a direct child, which my parents called a lot. I asked him why he didn't come to my meets, and he said, "Diane, you know how Cole gets nervous if I'm not there." I said, "I get nervous too." He said, "You're different. You handle things." I was 9 years old, and my father had already decided that my capacity to manage my own anxiety was a reason to deprive me of support, rather than a reason to trust me with more of it. That logic, "You're strong, therefore you need less," followed me for the next 20 years. I'll give you the financial accounting because it's important and because I'm a person who tracks things carefully, which is one of the few professional advantages of growing up in a family that taught you, very young, to document everything, just in case. Cole attended a private school called Westover Academy from 7th grade through 12th. Tuition averaged $22,000 a year. 6 years, $132,000. I went to public school my entire K through 12, which was fine. The schools in our district were genuinely good. But the reason I went to public school and Cole went to Westover wasn't resources, I would later understand. It was priority. When I was in middle school, my mother told me that private school wasn't right for everyone, and that I was the kind of student who could get just as much from the public system. Cole needed more structure, she said. Westover had small classes and individualized attention. The subtext was never stated, but it accumulated like sediment over years. Coal required investment. I would be fine regardless. College followed the same pattern, with the same rationalizations applied to higher dollar amounts. I got into the University of Oregon with a partial merit scholarship, enough to cover about a third of tuition, which I was genuinely proud of, and which my parents acknowledged with a dinner out that I remember partly because my mother spent most of it talking about Cole's upcoming middle school science fair. I took out loans for the rest, $44,000 over 4 years for my bachelor's degree in nursing. I worked 25 hours a week through most of college, hospital cafeteria, then a patient transport position that paid slightly better and gave me clinical exposure I could use on my resume. I graduated in 2013, licensed in 2014 after boards, and started as a floor nurse at a mid-size hospital outside Eugene before eventually moving to Portland and the cardiac unit, where I've been for 7 years. Cole enrolled in a business program at a private university in Seattle 2 years after I graduated. My parents paid his tuition in full. 4 years, $112,000, plus an apartment they covered because the dorms were too loud and Cole needed quiet to study. When I mentioned once, during a phone call in my second year of paying down my student loans, that I was finding the payments difficult, my mother said, "Well, Diane, you made the choice to do nursing. Cole is going into business. His earning potential is different." I didn't respond to that. I'd learned by then when a conversation wasn't actually a conversation. If this story's keeping you company, go ahead and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I see every comment. The monthly payments to my parents started in 2016. Cole had graduated and was job hunting and staying at their house, and the household bills had apparently gotten complicated, and my mother called and said they needed some help, just temporary, just until things leveled out. I said, okay, $300 a month. I'd been saying okay my whole life to requests from this family, and $300 felt manageable, and I told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. By 2018, it had become an expectation so embedded that my mother referenced it in passing conversations the way you'd reference a utility bill, just a fact of the household budget, not something that required acknowledgement or gratitude. I never missed a payment, not during my move to Portland, not when my car needed a transmission in 2019, not during the early months of the pandemic when the hospital was a war zone and I was working 60 hours a week in genuine terror. $300 a month for 8 years, $28,800. I kept a spreadsheet. I've kept spreadsheets of everything since I was in college, because at some point I understood that documentation was the only thing that stood between me and being told I was imagining things. I met Trevor at a work fundraiser in the fall of 2021. He's a physical therapist, thoughtful and stubborn in equal measure, and he noticed things about my family from the very first dinner we had with them, which was a birthday dinner for Cole's girlfriend, in which my parents had organized with a level of logistical effort they had never once applied to anything involving me. Trevor drove home afterward, and he was quiet for about 10 minutes, and then he said, "Your parents don't ask you anything." I said, "What?" He said, "The whole dinner. They asked Cole about his job promotion 4 separate times. They asked his girlfriend about her apartment renovation. They didn't ask you a single question about your life." I hadn't noticed, which is its own kind of testimony. I'd been managing around their disinterest for so long that I'd stopped registering it as absence. Trevor saw it fresh, and it landed on him differently. He started noticing other things after that. He noticed that when I got a certification in critical care nursing that I'd been working toward for 18 months, my mother said, "That's great, honey," and immediately pivoted to telling me about Cole's new car. He noticed that my parents knew the names of Cole's girlfriend's family members and had them over for holidays, but had met Trevor exactly twice in 2 years and never once initiated plans with him. He didn't push me about any of it. He just said, once, quietly, "I want you to know that the way your parents treat you is not the way people get to treat someone I love." I cried in the car on the way home, not because it hurt, it always hurt, but because having it named out loud by someone who loved me made it real in a new way. Cole married Bethany in June of 2023. The wedding was at a vineyard in the Willamette Valley. Beautiful venue, excellent food, 4 hours of dancing. My parents contributed $40,000. They gave Cole and Bethany a check for $15,000 as a wedding gift, on top of the contribution. My mother wore a dress she'd bought in Italy on a trip she and my father had taken to celebrate Cole's promotion the previous spring. I had not known about the Italy trip until she mentioned the dress. She did not invite me to go. She had not mentioned the trip until after it happened. I was in that family. I was their firstborn daughter, and I found out about a European vacation through a dress description at my brother's wedding reception. Trevor and I got engaged in March of 2024. I called my parents the same evening to tell them. My mother said, "Oh, congratulations. Is Trevor still at the same practice?" She asked one follow-up question about the ring, and then told me Cole and Bethany were thinking about buying a house in Bellevue, and did I know anything about the Bellevue real estate market? I got off the phone, and I sat with the feeling for a few minutes. And then I told Trevor, and he held my hand and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. My parents came to our engagement dinner 6 weeks later. My mother asked Trevor's parents 3 questions and spent most of the dinner discussing Cole's house search with my aunt, who was also there. My aunt, my father's sister Carol, caught my eye across the table at one point and gave me a look that I'd been receiving from her my whole life, a kind of pained acknowledgement. And I looked back at her, and then I looked away, because I wasn't ready yet to say out loud what that look was communicating. The wedding planning began, and my parents offered 2 things: $8,000 as a contribution, which was offered in a way that made it clear it was intended to cover roughly everything, and a list of their friends they wanted invited, which numbered 23 people and which would have consumed the majority of our guest capacity. I said no to the list and thanked them for the contribution, and started planning a wedding I could afford with what Trevor and I had saved. I won't tell you it didn't sting. It stung. But I had enough practice accepting that things would not be equal that I could metabolize it quickly and move on. And I did. Trevor and I set a date for September 2024 at a small venue in Southeast Portland that held 68 people and had a garden and decent lighting and a caterer I liked. In June of 2024, 3 months before our wedding, my parents flew to Bellevue to help Cole and Bethany close on their house. They stayed 9 days. My mother posted extensively on Facebook, helping Cole pick out kitchen fixtures, breakfast with Bethany's mother, sunset on the new back deck. So proud of you both. My father sent me a text the morning they arrived that said, "Here for Cole's house," with a house emoji. That was the entirety of the communication about the trip. They did not offer to visit us before our wedding. I had seen my parents twice in 2024 by that point, once at Christmas, once in March for my father's birthday dinner. Both times they were in Portland. Neither time did they come to see our apartment or ask about wedding planning in any detail. I called my mother in August, 6 weeks before the wedding, to confirm their travel arrangements. She said they were planning to drive up from Medford. They'd moved to Southern Oregon after retirement, and that it was about 4.5 hours, and they'd probably come up the day before. I said that sounded great. She said, "Your father's been having some knee trouble. The long drive might be hard." I said, "You just drove to Bellevue." She said, "That was different. We could stop whenever we wanted." I said, "You can stop on the way to Portland too, Mom." There was a pause that I recognized, the same pause that preceded every explanation for why something that applied to Cole didn't apply to me. And she said, "We'll figure it out, honey." My stomach tightened. I knew that pause. I knew what it meant. I told myself I was borrowing trouble and hung up the phone. 3 weeks before the wedding, I got a text from my father. "Diane, we need to talk about September. Call me when you can." I called him that night. He said my mother's knee had been really bothering her. It had switched from his knee to her knee in the intervening weeks, which I noted internally without saying anything. And the doctor had said she should limit long car trips. I said, "Dad, it's 4.5 hours. He said, "It's a lot of sitting." I said, "You drove 9 hours to Bellevue in June." Silence. Then, "Bellevue was important for Cole's closing." I said, My wedding is important to me. He said, "Diane, don't make this harder than it has to be. We'll celebrate with you afterward." "Well, come down for Thanksgiving. We can do a dinner." I held the phone away from my face for a moment. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about the drive to Bellevue, 9 hours, both of them in the car. No apparent knee trouble, because Cole needed them for his house closing. I thought about Italy. I thought about $28,000 and 2 parents who had never once asked what I needed it for. I said, "Okay, Dad," and I hung up. And then I sat on the bathroom floor and I thought, I am done saying okay. They did not come to my wedding. Trevor's parents were there, both of them, having driven from Boise, 5.5 hours. His sister flew in from Denver. My Aunt Carol drove up from Medford, same drive as my parents, same distance, and she was there 2 hours early, helping arrange flowers. She had driven past my parents' house on the way. She didn't mention it, and I didn't ask. 62 people filled that garden and said kind things and danced badly and loved me openly, and I walked down a small brick path on my Aunt Carol's arm because she had offered and I had said yes immediately, and the ceremony was 34 minutes, and the food was good, and Trevor cried when he saw me, and I thought, this is what showing up looks like. This is what I've been missing my whole life, and this room is full of it. My parents sent a card that arrived 2 days after the wedding. Inside was a check for $500 and a note in my mother's handwriting. "Sorry we couldn't make it. You looked beautiful in the photos. Love, Mom and Dad." I didn't cash the check. I put it in the folder where I keep documents I might need later, with a little note that said, "You looked beautiful in the photos." And I went back to being a newlywed and trying to feel what that was supposed to feel like, without the specific grief of having parents who watched me in photographs instead of in person. I stopped sending the monthly $300 in October. I didn't make an announcement about it. I just didn't send it. My mother called me on November 3rd and said, "Diane, I think there might have been an issue with the transfer this month." I said, "There wasn't an issue." Pause. "Oh," I said, "I've decided to stop the monthly payment." She said, "We've been counting on that." I said, "I know. That's part of why I'm stopping." She said, "That's not fair, Diane. We have expenses." And I said, "Talk to your attorney, Mom." And I hung up. I don't know why I said that. I hadn't spoken to an attorney. I didn't even have specific plans yet. But something in me was already moving toward what came next, even before I fully understood what that was. The Tuesday night when I found the account balance happened 2 weeks after that phone call. I hadn't been looking for anything unusual. I'd been having a late night after a brutal 12-hour shift. I was tired and slightly disorganized, and I clicked the wrong tab in our financial portal, and there was an account I'd barely thought about in years. My grandfather, my mother's father, had opened it for me in 2003 when I was 13. He told me it was for college, that he'd been saving for a while, and that it would help when the time came. He died in 2009, and my parents became co-trustees by virtue of being my parents. I'd thought about it occasionally over the years, wondered how it was doing, assumed it was there and growing, never checked carefully because I had been raised to believe that family financial management was handled by adults and that my job was to trust the process. I was 33 years old, and I had never fully internalized that I was the adult now, that the process was not something happening on my behalf, that trust was a legal instrument, not an emotion, and that the people managing it had specific legal obligations that I had never once asked them to account for. The account had been opened with $40,000 from my grandfather's savings. Over the years, per the statements I was now reading for the first time with any real attention, it had grown to approximately $68,000 by 2018. Then the withdrawals started. They were categorized, every single one of them, as educational expenses or qualified family education distribution. They came in amounts that ranged from $800 to $4,000. They were spaced about 5 to 8 weeks apart. By the time I was looking at this screen at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, they had reduced the account from $68,000 to $312. The last withdrawal had been 4 months earlier. 41 months of quiet, consistent drainage. I sat with this for a very long time. I went and got a glass of water. I came back and looked at the screen again. I thought about what $68,000 would have looked like applied to my student loan balance in 2018, which had been at $40,000 at that point, and which I was still paying down at a rate that kept me from building any real savings. I thought about what $68,000 represented in the context of my life versus what it might represent to whoever had received these distributions. Then I went and woke Trevor up. He read the statements I'd printed by the time I got to the printer and back, moving quietly so I wouldn't have to explain everything twice. He read without saying anything for about 5 minutes, which is how Trevor processes information. He goes quiet, and then he says something precise. What he said was, "Do you know where this money went?" I said no. He said, "Then that's the first thing we need to find out." He got up and made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table at midnight and started making a list of what I knew and what I needed to find out and who I needed to call in the morning. I cried once, briefly, somewhere around 12:30, and Trevor put his hand over mine and said, "You have every right to be angry about this." And I thought, yes, I do. And I'm going to need to keep that anger cold and organized and useful, because warm anger gets you nowhere, and I have work to do. The attorney's name was Sandra Fitch, and I found her through a colleague whose family had dealt with a similar trust dispute 2 years prior. Her office was in downtown Portland, 3rd floor, plants everywhere, the kind of organized chaos that suggested a very busy and very competent person. She was 60, direct, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on while she reviewed the documents I'd brought. I'd spent the previous 3 days gathering everything I could find: the original trust instrument from 2003, every statement I could access going back to 2015, my grandfather's death certificate and will, a copy of the co-trustee designation that added my parents to the account after he died. Sandra read everything in about 20 minutes, and then she looked at me over the reading glasses she'd just put back on and she said, "Ms. Calloway, your parents withdrew funds from an account that was designated for your benefit as the named beneficiary. The trust documents specify that distributions are to be used for your educational expenses, your medical needs, or your documented personal benefit. Do you have documentation of any such expenses during the period of the withdrawals?" I said no. She said, "Then we have a clear breach of fiduciary duty. The question is where the money went, because that determines our options and our targets." I said, "How do we find that out?" And she explained the discovery process to me in terms I could follow, because Sandra Fitch had the quality I most value in any professional I hire. She treated me like I was capable of understanding the situation I was in. What discovery uncovered, over the following 6 weeks, was a story I'd been living inside without knowing its financial architecture. Cole and Bethany's house in Bellevue, the 9-hour drive, the 9 days of Facebook documentation, had required a down payment of $60,000. Cole had contributed $20,000, my parents had contributed $20,000 from their own savings, and the remaining $20,000 had come from my trust account in 6 separate withdrawals over the preceding 14 months, categorized as family education expense, which my parents had apparently decided was a flexible enough category to include down payment assistance for their son's home purchase. The Bellevue kitchen fixtures my mother had Facebooked about, the back deck, the move that had prompted the 9-hour drive while their knee trouble prevented a 4.5-hour drive to my wedding. All of it underwritten, in part, by $68,000 that my grandfather had saved for me. There were other distributions, too, smaller ones that Sandra traced to Cole's wedding expenses in 2023, a contribution to Bethany's parents for the rehearsal dinner that my parents had apparently offered to co-sponsor, a payment toward Cole's car loan that had been characterized on the trust statement as an educational technology expense, which, Sandra told me with a look that suggested she had seen everything in her career, but this particular category description still impressed her. I did not find this funny in the moment. I found it clarifying. Every fresh piece of information clarified something I'd been confused about for years. Why my parents always seemed financially comfortable despite being on fixed income. why they were able to contribute $40,000 to Cole's wedding and cover his apartment through college and fly to Bellevue for 9 days. Why all of this was possible while my requests for any assistance, financial or otherwise, were met with references to being stretched thin. They hadn't been stretched thin. They'd been spending money that wasn't theirs. They'd been spending mine. The discovery process also turned up something Sandra called a secondary concern, which was the category notation issue. Using a trust account for non-qualifying distributions and documenting them falsely as qualifying educational expenses is not merely a breach of fiduciary duty. It can constitute financial fraud. Sandra walked me through this carefully and without drama because she was the kind of attorney who wanted her clients to understand their situation and make informed decisions rather than react emotionally to language like fraud. She said, "I want you to know what's possible here, not because I'm recommending every available avenue, but because you deserve the full picture." The full picture included civil litigation for restitution, removal of my parents as trustees, which was moot given the account was nearly empty but legally significant, and a potential referral to the State Financial Crimes Unit, depending on what the documentation showed. I sat with that for a few days. I sat with the word fraud and turned it over. My parents weren't criminals in the sense I'd always associated with that word. They were people who had decided over and over again, in dozens of small choices and a handful of large ones, that my interests were fungible and Cole's were not. They had taken that logic and applied it to a legal instrument with a named beneficiary and documented restrictions. And they had made 41 withdrawals over 41 months, and not once, apparently, thought about what would happen when I found out. Or maybe they'd thought I wouldn't find out. Maybe they'd counted on the same quality they'd always relied on, my willingness to say, okay, my capacity to absorb and move on, my legendary independence. They had mistaken endurance for compliance. That was their last mistake. I called my Aunt Carol before I contacted my parents because Carol had been a witness to my family for my entire life, and because the look she'd given me across the dinner table at my engagement party was the look of someone who knew something and had been waiting to be asked. I called her on a Sunday morning, and I told her what I'd found and what Sandra had told me. And Carol was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandfather told your mother the money was for you specifically. He said it in front of me. He said he'd watched how things worked in that family, and he wanted to make sure you had something that was yours alone." I said, "Did you know they were using it for Cole?" She said, "I suspected. I saw things that didn't add up, the Bellevue down payment, the wedding contribution, and I knew your grandfather's account should have gone to your student loans, not to real estate in Washington. But I didn't have proof, and I didn't want to cause trouble between you and your parents if I was wrong." I said, "You weren't wrong." She said, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." I said, "I'm not calling to assign blame. I'm calling to ask if you'll talk to my attorney." She said, "Yes, absolutely yes, whatever you need." The demand letter went out on a Wednesday in late January. Sandra had drafted it over 2 weeks, precise and thorough, citing specific sections of Oregon trust law, documenting each withdrawal and its documented versus actual purpose, and demanding full restitution of $67,640, the full amount distributed minus the $312 that remained, plus interest calculated from the date of each withdrawal, plus legal fees. The total came to $81,200 and some dollars. The letter was sent certified mail and email simultaneously, and it included a 14-day response deadline and a clear statement that failure to respond would result in civil litigation, with a notation about the possibility of referral to the State Financial Crimes Division. My mother called me the next morning. I'd expected this. I prepared for it the way I prepare for difficult things, which is to think through what I know to be true and hold on to that. Because the noise that comes at you in conversations like this is designed to make you doubt what you know. She started crying before she finished her first sentence, which made me feel something complicated. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of grief for the version of this relationship that I'd always wanted and never gotten. And a recognition that her tears were not about me, were not about what had been taken from me, were about her own fear and her own exposure, and that I needed to hold those two things separately. She said, "We were going to pay it back." This is apparently what people say in these situations. I'd heard it before. I said, "Mom, when?" She said, "When Cole got established, when things leveled out." I said, "It's been 7 years." She said, "We thought you were fine, Diane. You've always been fine." There it was, the sentence that had shaped my entire life. I said, "I'm fine because I worked 12-hour shifts in a cardiac ICU and paid $44,000 in student loans that I didn't need to take out. I'm fine because I made myself fine. That isn't the same thing as not needing the money." She cried harder. I said, "Talk to your attorney, Mom. I'm not able to have this conversation with you directly anymore." My father called that evening. He was less tearful and more tactical, which I'd expected. My father processes crisis by looking for angles, for arguments, for the version of events that puts him in the most defensible position. He said the account had been used for family purposes, which was a stretch of the trustee language that Sandra had told me he might try. He said my grandfather would have wanted the family taken care of. I said he specifically told Aunt Carol the money was for me. Silence. He said, "Carol shouldn't be involved in this." I said, "Carol is a witness who watched Grandpa establish this account and explain its purpose, and she'll say so in a deposition." More silence. He said, "This is going to destroy the family, Diane." I said, "The family was already not what I thought it was. That's not something I did." He said, "You've always been dramatic." I thought about how many times I'd been called dramatic. I thought about the wedding card with the $500 check that I hadn't cashed. I said, "I'll let Sandra handle it from here," and I hung up. Cole called me 2 days later. I'd been wondering when he would. He led with the line that I assume my parents had coached, which was that he hadn't known where the down payment money came from. I believe that's possibly true. I also believe it doesn't change anything materially, because whether Cole knew the specific source of the $20,000 or not, he had benefited from a system his entire life that allocated family resources in one direction. And that system had a specific funding mechanism that he'd never questioned because he'd never had a reason to question it. I said, "Cole, I'm not trying to hurt you." He said, "It feels like you are." I said, "I know. I understand that. But you have to understand that what I'm doing is asking for what's mine, what Grandpa left for me specifically." He said, "Mom and Dad are really scared, Diane." I said, "They should have thought about that before they spent it." He said, "That's cold." I said, "Maybe." I didn't say, "I learned cold from a family that decided I was the independent one and applied that independence to every decision that cost them anything." I didn't say that, because Cole wasn't the architect of this, even if he was its principal beneficiary. I said, "Cole, I love you. This isn't about you, but I'm not going to drop it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know, Diane." I really didn't. I said, "Okay," and I meant it. And then I said, "I have to go." And I got off the phone and sat with the strange, complicated texture of loving your brother and still holding the people responsible for your shared history to account. The settlement negotiations started in March, 7 weeks after the demand letter. My parents had hired an attorney, a man named Griswold, who Sandra knew and described as capable but not creative, which I took as a positive sign. The initial counteroffer was $40,000 in restitution, which was less than 2/3 of what they'd taken, and which did not include interest. Sandra told me to decline. I declined. The second offer was $55,000 with a 5-year payment plan. Sandra told me this was getting closer, but that the payment timeline was too long and there was no admission of wrongdoing language. I declined. The third offer came in late April and was $63,000, still short of the full restitution, but including interest, with an 18-month payment plan and language in the settlement agreement acknowledging that funds had been distributed from a restricted trust account for the benefit of persons other than the named beneficiary. Sandra said, That last phrase is important. It's as close to an admission as we're going to get without going to trial. I said, "What's your honest assessment of trial?" She said, "You'd likely win and recover the full amount, but it would take a year and a half, and you'd spend that year and a half in depositions and document review and managing your parents' counterclaims, because Griswold will file counterclaims just to create pressure. The extra $18,000 isn't nothing, but you need to decide if your time and energy for the next 18 months are worth $18,000. I thought about that for 3 days. I thought about what 18 months of litigation would cost me in focus and sleep and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from unresolved conflict with people you're related to. I thought about $63,000 landing in an account that would be entirely mine. I said yes. We settled. The settlement agreement was signed on the 15th of May. My parents would pay $63,000 in 3 installments over 18 months. The settlement acknowledged the improper distributions. My parents were permanently removed as trustees of the account, which was largely symbolic given there was almost nothing left in it, but which mattered to me in a way that was harder to explain than the money itself. Being permanently removed meant it was on record. It meant that some document, somewhere, said that my parents had not done right by their daughter's trust, and that a court had recognized it. I needed that. I needed the world to have noted it somewhere. The first installment arrived in June, $21,000. I sat at the kitchen table with the deposit confirmation on my screen and Trevor beside me, and I thought about my grandfather, who had died when I was 19, and who I'd mourned then with the ordinary grief of losing a grandparent, and who I was now mourning again for a different reason. The grief of understanding how clearly he had seen what was happening to me, and how carefully he had tried to build a wall around my future, and how thoroughly my parents had dismantled that wall, one categorized transaction at a time. I thought about what he'd told Carol, that he'd watched how things worked in that family. He'd watched, he'd seen, and he'd tried. I put the $21,000 into a high-yield savings account I'd opened specifically for this money, separate from everything else, and I labeled it in the account management system with his name. I paid off my student loans in September when the second installment came, $19,000 remaining on the original $44,000 after years of payments. I logged into the loan servicer portal and made a payment for the full balance. Confirmation pending. Confirmation complete. Balance, 0. I've been carrying that number since I was 22 years old. 11 years. I don't have a dramatic description of how it felt because I was sitting in a hospital break room on a 15-minute respite from a 12-hour shift, and dramatic is not available in those circumstances. What I felt was a quiet subtraction, like a sound that had been running in the background for so long you'd stopped consciously hearing it, suddenly gone. The silence of owing nothing. In November, Trevor and I closed on a house in North Portland. 2 bedrooms, a third room I use as a study, a backyard with a fig tree that the previous owners had planted and that had produced fruit the fall we moved in, which I took as a reasonable sign. The down payment came partly from our savings and partly from the settlement, and the mortgage payment is $340 more per month than our previous rent, which Trevor and I have both noted is approximately the same amount that had been going to my parents for 8 years prior. We've started putting that $340 into a travel fund instead. We've been to 2 places in the past year that we'd talked about going for years without quite managing it. We're going somewhere in the spring that Trevor has been wanting to visit since college. I'm not going to tell you these things feel like justice exactly, because justice is a cleaner word than what actually happens when you spend years inside a family dynamic and then spend more years extricating yourself from it. What it feels like is movement, forward movement specifically, in a direction I chose. I talk to my parents twice a year now, Thanksgiving and my mother's birthday in February. The conversations are careful and short, and Trevor usually finds a reason to be in another room during them, not because he's protecting himself from the discomfort, but because he's protecting me from feeling watched while I navigate it. My mother asks about work, my father asks about the house. Neither of them has said the word trust to me since the settlement. I don't expect they will. I've stopped expecting things from them that they've demonstrated they can't provide, and I've stopped interpreting that as a failure on my part. That shift, from expecting to accepting, from hoping to observing, took more work than the legal process, honestly. The legal process had clear steps and definable outcomes. The internal process is slower and less linear and never quite finished. Cole and I have a better relationship now, oddly. That's not something I predicted. I think the lawsuit, or the knowledge underneath the lawsuit, the full accounting of how things had worked for our entire lives, broke something open between us that turned out to be more useful than the polite distance we'd maintained before. He called me in August, unprompted, to tell me he'd found out what my grandfather's account had been used for, specifically because my parents had to disclose some of it during the settlement negotiations, and some of it had gotten back to him. He said, "I knew they helped me more. I didn't know it came from something specific that was yours." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Thank you for saying that." We talked for an hour about things we'd never talked about directly before, the way things had worked in our family, the way we'd each understood our different positions in it, the things we'd each told ourselves to make it make sense. It was the most honest conversation I'd had with my brother in maybe my entire life. I don't know what we are now, closer, maybe, or just different, but we're something more real than we were, and I'll take that. My Aunt Carol and I have dinner once a month. She drove up for our housewarming in November, and she brought a plant for the backyard and a card that said, in her handwriting, "Your grandfather would have loved this. He would have loved you exactly as you are." I put the card on the refrigerator, and I've left it there. It's been 4 months, and I look at it every morning when I get coffee, and I think about a man who saw what was happening to his granddaughter and tried, with the tools available to him, to build her something solid. I've been thinking about what to do with the final settlement installment when it arrives in December. I have an idea that involves a scholarship fund at the Oregon Nursing Foundation for students in financial need who are completing their RN licensing requirements, the specific point in the education pipeline where I had the least support and the most pressure, and where a few $1,000s would have changed the texture of a very hard year. I'm calling it the Arthur Hess Fund, after my grandfather. I've already talked to the foundation about the framework. They seemed interested. The paperwork is in progress. I am a person who keeps paperwork in order. I always have been. My family called it anxious. My colleagues call it organized. I call it knowing, from a very young age, that documentation is the only thing that reliably stands between you and being told you imagined something that actually happened. I have the original trust document from 2003 in a fireproof box in our study. I have the settlement agreement in a folder marked with the year. I have a spreadsheet that goes back to 2016, showing $300 a month, every month, 288 rows. I have a deposit confirmation from a savings account labeled with my grandfather's name. I have a zero balance on a student loan account I opened at 22. And I have a card on my refrigerator that says, "Someone would have loved me exactly as I am." That last one is the document I check most often. It turns out to be the one that required the most years to collect.